Before the first God, before the first word, before light knew what light was, there was chaos. Not chaos as we understand it today, not disorder, not noise. Something far more unsettling, a vast, yawning openness that the ancient Greeks called chaos, from the verb chaino, meaning to gape, to open wide. A mouth before it had anything to say, a darkness that was not the absence of light, but the absence of the very concept of light. This is where the Greeks began their story of everything. And once you understand what they actually meant, you will never look at the night sky the same way again. Imagine standing at the edge of something that has no edge, no sound, because sound requires air, and air requires space, and space had not yet decided to exist. No temperature, because warmth and cold are relationships, and there was nothing yet to relate. Only this, an infinite openness, neither full nor empty, neither alive nor dead, suspended in a state that Hesiod, writing in the 8th century BCE, described in the Theogony with a word so precise it has never been fully translated: chaos. Scholars have spent centuries trying to capture it, a gap, a gulf, a chasm, but every translation loses something, because what Hesiod was pointing to was not a thing at all. It was a condition, a potential. The universe, holding its breath before it, remembered how to breathe. The Greeks were not the first people to ask where everything came from. The Mesopotamians had their Enuma Elish, the Egyptians their primordial waters of Nun, the Vedic traditions their cosmic egg, suspended in infinite darkness. Every civilization that ever looked up at the stars eventually turned that gaze inward and asked the same question: what was there before the first thing? What the Greeks gave the world was not simply an answer, but a framework, a way of imagining origination that embedded within it a profound and deeply unsettling truth: that creation does not begin with order. It begins with openness, with absence, with the terrifying freedom of a space that contains no rules, because no rules have yet been made. Hesiod wrote the Theogony, the birth of the gods, around 700 BCE, drawing on oral traditions far older than his own lifetime. He was a farmer from Boeotia, a man who claimed the muses themselves spoke to him on the slopes of Mount Helicon and commanded him to sing of the origins of the sacred things. Whether one takes that claim literally or as the poetic convention of his age, what Hesiod produced was something extraordinary, a systematic genealogy of the cosmos, a document that would shape Western thought for 3,000 years. Philosophers would argue with it, scientists would unknowingly echo it, psychologists would eventually rediscover its deepest insights, as if for the first time. What makes the Theogony remarkable is not its poetry alone, though the poetry is extraordinary, but its underlying architecture. Hesiod understood, perhaps instinctively, that you cannot tell the story of creation without first accounting for the condition that made creation possible. And that condition, he insisted, was not darkness, was not water, was not fire. It was openness itself, chaos, the gaping, the void that somehow in its very emptiness contained the seed of everything that would ever exist. And then, without explanation, without cause, without a creator standing outside the process and setting it in motion, something stirred within that void. Not a god, not a will, something more fundamental than either. Something the Greeks would name, and in naming it, change the history of human thought forever. What emerged from chaos was not what you might expect, and understanding what it was, and why the Greeks placed it there at the very foundation of existence, will reveal something about the ancient mind that modern culture has almost entirely forgotten. From chaos they came, not summoned, not created, not willed into being by any hand or voice. They simply emerged, as if existence itself had been waiting for permission it never needed to ask. Hesiod names them with the precision of a man who understands that names are not labels, but definitions. First, Gaia, the broad-breasted earth, foundation of all things, the first surface upon which anything could stand. Then Tartarus, the deep abyss beneath the earth, a place so far below the roots of the world that Hesiod writes in the Theogony that an anvil dropped from heaven would fall 9 days before reaching its floor. Then Eros, and here the ancient Greek imagination does something that stops modern readers cold. Before there were human hearts to feel desire, before there were bodies to attract or eyes to admire, before there was a single living creature in all of existence, the Greeks placed desire itself at the foundation of the cosmos. Eros, the force of attraction, the principle that draws things toward things, that refuses separation, that insists on connection even in a universe that has not yet produced anything to connect. And finally, from chaos itself, Erebus, the primordial darkness beneath the earth, and Nyx, the night, ancient, vast, and so powerful that even Zeus himself, as Homer notes in the Iliad, feared to anger her. These 5, Chaos, Gaia, Tartarus, Eros, Erebus, Nyx, were not gods in the way we typically imagine gods. They were not personalities with preferences and grudges and love affairs. They were conditions, principles, the minimum requirements for a universe to exist at all. You need space, chaos. You need a surface, Gaia. You need depth, Tartarus. You need the force that binds, Eros. You need darkness in its 2 forms, the darkness of the underground and the darkness of the sky. The Greeks were not being poetic. Or rather, they were being poetic in precisely the way that the deepest truths require poetry, because some realities are too fundamental for prose. The etymology of these names carries its own revelation. Gaia derives from a Proto-Indo-European root connected to the earth, the ground, the tangible. She is what can be touched, what holds weight, what refuses to disappear. Tartarus has no clear Greek etymology, which scholars interpret as evidence of great antiquity, a word borrowed from a tradition so old its origins have been swallowed by time. Nyx, from the Greek nix, simply meaning night, but a night that predates the sun, that existed before there was a day to contrast it against. And Eros, from the Greek verb erastai, to desire, a word whose root appears across the ancient world, in forms that suggest this concept was never local, never merely Greek, but something the human mind independently discovered was necessary to explain why anything coheres at all. What the Greeks understood, and what most modern retellings obscure by rushing toward the more dramatic stories of Zeus and the Olympians, is that the creation myth proper, the deep creation, the origination of conditions, was not about personalities at all. It was about principles, and chief among those principles, placed with unmistakable intentionality at the very dawn of existence, was the principle that the universe is not held together by force, but by longing. Eros does not compel. Eros attracts. And in that distinction, the ancient Greeks embedded a cosmological argument that modern physics would spend centuries approaching from a different direction, that the universe tends toward connection, that matter calls to matter, that what exists leans toward what else exists with something that, if you did not know better, you might call love. From Erebus and Nyx, through their union in the primordial dark, came ether, the bright upper air, the luminous substance that the gods breathed, and Hemera, day. Light was not created by a god. It was born. It was the child of darkness and darkness together, as if night had always contained within itself the seed of its own opposite. And from Gaia, without partner, without union, through what Hesiod describes simply as her own power and desire, came Ouranos, the starry heaven, and Pontus, the deep sea. This, the Greeks insisted, was how the world truly began, not with command, not with craftsmanship, not with a divine architect consulting a blueprint, but with an opening, a stirring, a longing, and then slowly, inevitably, the principles necessary for existence arranging themselves like the first notes of a symphony, finding their places before the music has a name. But what the Theogony gives with one hand, it complicates with the other. Because once Gaia and Uranos came together, what followed was not harmony, but something far darker, far older, and far more recognizable to any honest human heart. The sky loved the earth with a love that became a prison. Uranos, the starry heaven, lay upon Gaia every night, vast, suffocating, infinite, and as Gaia brought forth children from their union, the 12 Titans, colossal and radiant, the 3 Cyclopes, each bearing a single eye like a lamp in the dark, the 3 Hecatoncheires, 100-handed giants whose strength shook the foundations of what the world was still learning to be. Uranos looked upon them and felt something that God should not feel. Fear. Fear of what he had helped create. Fear of the magnitude of his own offspring. And so he did what fearful power has always done throughout the long, terrible history of the world. He pushed them back, into Gaia herself, back into the darkness from which they came, refusing to let them be born, sealing them inside their mother's body, as if he could unmake what existence had already decided. Hesiod records Gaia's suffering with a gravity that transcends mythology and enters something closer to testimony. She groaned. The earth groaned under the weight of her own children trapped within her, and in that groaning she devised the plan that would change the structure of existence forever. From her own substance, grey adamant, the hardest material the cosmos had yet produced, she fashioned a sickle, and she asked her children, still imprisoned in her darkness, which among them would take it and do what needed to be done. Only one answered, the youngest Titan, Kronos. This is the first rupture, the moment the myth accelerates from cosmology into something that feels terrifyingly intimate. Kronos took the sickle. He waited in the darkness of his mother's body as Uranos descended to cover Gaia in the night, and at the moment of their union, at the moment the sky pressed down upon the earth with all its weight and all its hunger, Kronos reached out with his left hand, and with his right hand swung the adamantine blade and severed his father from the act that had defined him. The wound was absolute. Uranos recoiled into the heights of the sky, bleeding light and divinity, and from what fell into the sea, from that severed piece of heaven cast into the foam, the Aphros, Aphrodite arose. The goddess of love and beauty, born not from tenderness, but from violence, not from union, but from rupture. The sea received what the sky had lost and transformed it into something the world had never seen before. Grace, desire given a face, longing given a form that could walk upon the earth and be looked at and ache for. And Kronos, now king of the cosmos, became precisely what he had overthrown. Because power that rises through fear does not forget how to be afraid. He swallowed his children whole, one by one, as Rhea bore them, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon. Kronos took each newborn into his hands and swallowed them before they could draw their second breath. He had been warned by his parents that his own child would one day overthrow him, and he had decided to make time itself his weapon, to consume the future before it could arrive. But Rhea, patient, grieving, infinite in her endurance, went to her parents Gaia and Uranos when her 6th child was ready to be born. She traveled to Crete, to a deep cave on Mount Ida, and there in the darkness she delivered Zeus. And in his place she wrapped a stone in swaddling cloth and brought it to Kronos, who swallowed it without suspicion, because the powerful rarely look closely at what is given to them freely. Zeus grew in secret. Nurtured by the nymph Amalthea, guarded by the Curettes, whose clashing shields drowned the sound of his infant cries, raised in the island cave while his father sat upon the throne of the world and thought himself eternal. When Zeus was grown, he returned, He forced Kronos to disgorge what he had swallowed. First the stone, then the gods, one by one, exactly as they had been consumed. They emerged unchanged, intact, imprisoned time released all at once. What followed was the Titanomachy, 10 years of war, recorded in the Theogony with the weight of something that shook not just the earth, but the very structure of reality. The Olympians above, the Titans below, the cosmos torn between two orders of being. Zeus freed the Cyclopes from Tartarus, and they gave him thunder and lightning in gratitude. He freed the Hecaton, and their 100 hands hurled boulders like rain. The sea boiled, the earth burned, Tartarus itself groaned with the reverberations of a war that had no precedent, because there had been no time before in which such a war could have occurred. When it ended, the Titans were cast into Tartarus, bound, guarded by the Hecaton, sealed beneath the earth with walls of bronze, and locked with gates that not even the gods above could easily open. And Zeus divided what remained, the sea to Poseidon, the underworld to Hades, the sky and the governance of all things to himself. The cosmos had its shape at last, but it had arrived at that shape through suffering so vast, it had altered the nature of existence itself. The world we live in, the Greeks were saying, was not designed, it was won. And that distinction carries a weight that the next layer of this myth, its symbolic and psychological architecture, makes impossible to ignore. Every myth is a confession, and the Greek creation myth, read carefully, confesses something about the human condition so precise, so unflinching, that it feels less like ancient storytelling and more like a diagnosis written in the language of the sacred. Begin with chaos, not the word as modern culture uses it, but the concept as Hesiod intended it, the primordial opening, the gaping void that precedes all form. Carl Jung spent decades mapping the architecture of the human psyche, and what he found at its deepest layer bears an uncanny resemblance to what Hesiod placed at the foundation of the cosmos. Jung called it the unconscious, not merely the personal repository of forgotten memories and suppressed desires, but a vast, formless depth that underlies all conscious experience, that contains within it everything that has not yet become defined, everything that exists as potential before it becomes actual. Chaos in this reading is not the beginning of the universe, it is the beginning of awareness, the moment before the mind knows what it is, the darkness that every human being carries within them, not as a flaw, but as a foundation. And then Eros, placed at the dawn of existence, before any being capable of feeling desire had yet emerged, Eros announces something that the Greeks understood with a clarity that much of Western thought has since struggled to recover, that the universe is not fundamentally mechanical, it is fundamentally relational. Things do not simply exist in isolation and then happen to encounter one another. They lean toward one another. They are shaped by their orientation toward what they are not. Joseph Campbell, writing in The Hero with 1,000 Faces, identified this principle across mythologies separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. The force that the Greeks named Eros, the Hindus named Kama, the Chinese named Di, the force that in every tradition is placed not as an emotion but as a cosmological principle. The universe holds together not because it must, but because in some sense the ancient mind could only express through myth. It wants to. Uranos pressing down upon Gaia, suffocating, refusing to release his children, is not simply a story about a tyrannical sky god. It is a portrait of every creative force that turns upon what it has generated out of fear. Uranos loves, but his love is possessive. His love does not want its object to grow beyond it, and what he produces by this possessive love is not peace, but accumulation, pressure building in the darkness, children waiting to be born, a groaning that cannot be silenced indefinitely. Mircea Eliade, in his study of myth and the sacred, identified this pattern as one of the most ancient and universal in human religious thought. The principle that creation requires sacrifice, that new order can only emerge through the rupture of what preceded it. The old must be wounded for the new to breathe, not destroyed. Uranos still exists, still circles overhead, but limited. His absolute dominion must be broken for anything else to live. Kronos swallowing his children is perhaps the myth's most psychologically transparent image. He is time devouring the future. He is the established order consuming what would succeed it. And he is, more personally, every human impulse to control what cannot be controlled, to prevent change by refusing to allow what change requires, the emergence of something genuinely new. What Rhea does in response is equally significant. She does not confront Kronos directly. She does not match his power with power. She goes to the deep places, to the cave, to the earth herself, and she hides the truth. She gives the devouring force a stone instead of the living thing, and in doing so, she teaches the cosmos its first lesson in the difference between appearance and reality, between what power thinks it has consumed and what actually survives beneath its notice. Zeus, raised in the cave of Crete, nurtured in secret, growing in the darkness while the established order believes itself secure. This is the archetypal pattern Campbell named the hero's journey in its most elemental form. The hero does not begin in power. The hero begins in concealment, in a place where the forces that would destroy him cannot see him. And the journey from that hidden cave to the throne of heaven is not a journey of conquest alone, but of integration. Because what Zeus ultimately accomplishes is not merely the defeat of the Titans, but the inclusion of what they represented. The Olympian cosmos is not built on the ruins of the old order. It is built on top of it, with Tartarus containing the Titans as the unconscious contains its depths. Sealed, yes, but not destroyed. Present, influential, occasionally erupting into the world above in ways that remind Olympus it was not always thus. The Greeks, in other words, were not describing the creation of a perfect world. They were describing the creation of a functional one. A cosmos shaped by conflict and compromise, by forces partially contained and partially expressed, by a sky that still circles overhead even after its wound, and a darkness below that holds what could not be integrated. A world that looks unmistakably like the one we actually inhabit. And embedded within this architecture are details, variants, fragments, alternative cosmogonies that most retellings never reach, because they require a willingness to sit with complexity that the simplified version of the myth was never designed to demand. The version of the Greek creation myth most people know is Hesiod's. But Hesiod was not the only Greek who looked into the void and tried to describe what he found there. And what the others found was, in certain ways, even stranger. The Orphic tradition, a religious movement that flourished in Greece from at least the 6th century BCE, connected to the legendary poet-prophet Orpheus, and documented in the Orphic hymns, the Orphic rhapsodies, and most remarkably in the Theogony papyrus, the oldest surviving European book manuscript recovered from a funeral pyre in northern Greece in 1962. Offered a creation account so different from Hesiod's that it reads almost like a deliberate correction. In the Orphic cosmogony, chaos is not the first principle. Before chaos, there was Kronos, not Kronos the Titan, but an entirely separate being, primordial time personified, a serpentine figure coiled in the void, ageless and without beginning. Kronos produced from himself a great silver egg suspended in the abyss, and from that egg, cracking open in the primordial darkness, releasing light into a universe that had never known it, emerged Phanes, the Shining One, the first god of the Orphic tradition, androgynous and radiant, bearing within his luminous body the seeds of all things that would ever exist. Phanes is almost entirely absent from popular retellings of Greek mythology, and his absence is a significant omission. He was understood by the Orphics not merely as a deity, but as the principle of manifestation itself, the force by which potential becomes actual, by which the invisible becomes visible, by which what exists in darkness finds its way into light. The Theogony papyrus, subjected to decades of scholarly analysis since its recovery, reveals that these were not merely poetic images, but genuine philosophical propositions, debated seriously by thinkers who saw in the Orphic cosmogony a more rigorous account of origination than Hesiod's genealogical approach could provide. The papyrus itself appears to be a philosophical commentary on an Orphic poem, written in the late 5th or early 4th century BCE, and its discovery transformed scholarly understanding of how sophisticated early Greek religious thought truly was. The divergence between Hesiod's cosmogony and the Orphic one was not simply a matter of competing stories. It reflected a genuine intellectual debate about the nature of the first principle, whether it was spatial, as Hesiod's gaping chaos suggested, or temporal, as the Orphic Chronos insisted, or luminous, as Phanes embodied. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BCE, engaged seriously with these competing accounts in his Physics and Metaphysics, treating them not as mythology to be dismissed, but as early philosophical hypotheses about the nature of origination. The pre-Socratic philosophers, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Heraclitus, were in direct conversation with these mythological frameworks, translating their core questions into the language of natural philosophy while retaining their essential structure. What Anaximander called the apeiron, the boundless, indeterminate principle from which all things emerge and to which all things return, is, in ways that scholars have documented extensively, a philosophical reformulation of Hesiod's chaos dressed in the language of reason rather than myth. There are further layers that popular accounts consistently omit. The Theogony itself contains a variant tradition about the birth of Aphrodite that stands in direct tension with the more familiar Homeric account. In Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, Aphrodite is the daughter of Zeus and the Titaness Dione, born through the conventional union of divine parents. In Hesiod, she is born from sea foam and severed divinity, a child of violence and the ocean's transformation. These two versions coexisted in ancient Greek religion without apparent need for resolution, which tells us something important about how the Greeks understood myth. Not as history requiring internal consistency, but as a repertoire of images, each true in its own register, each illuminating a different facet of the same reality. The influence of the Greek creation myth on the history of ideas extends far beyond philosophy and religion. The Roman poet Ovid, writing his Metamorphoses in the 1st century BCE, opened with a creation account drawn directly from the Greek tradition, but filtered through Stoic philosophy, describing chaos as a formless mass from which an unnamed god or nature separated the elements, producing a version of origination that influenced Christian theological thinking about creation far more than is commonly acknowledged. Early church fathers, including Justin Martyr and Clement of Alexandria, engaged extensively with Greek cosmogony precisely because they recognized in it conceptual frameworks that both challenged and, in certain respects, illuminated their own theological claims. The doctrine of creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing, was developed in part as a deliberate theological contrast to the Greek model, in which creation does not come from nothing but from chaos, from the primordial opening that was itself already something. And in the caves of Crete, where myth placed the infant Zeus in hiding, archaeologists have found evidence of religious activity stretching back to the Minoan period, suggesting that the mythological significance of those deep places predates the Greek civilization that inherited and transformed it, a reminder that the stories we call Greek were already ancient when the Greeks first told them. What endures in all of these versions, across all of their differences, is a single insistence, that the beginning was not simple, and that whoever or whatever we are, we did not arrive here without cost. There is a question the Greek creation myth never answers directly. It circles around it. It approaches it from different angles, in different traditions, in different centuries, but it never quite lands. And that, perhaps, is the most honest thing about it. What was there before chaos? Hesiod does not say. The Orphics gesture toward primordial time, but Kronos himself has no origin, no parent, no moment of beginning. He simply is, coiled in the void, ageless, without cause. Even the most rigorous ancient philosophical traditions, when pressed to their foundations, eventually arrived at the same threshold. A point beyond which thought could not travel, a boundary where language began to dissolve into silence. The Greeks did not interpret this silence as failure. They interpreted it as reverence. Some things, the ancient mind understood, are not meant to be resolved. They are meant to be inhabited, held as open questions that keep the soul from the dangerous comfort of false certainty. This is what myth does, that philosophy and science, for all their power, cannot fully replicate. It holds the question open. It gives the unanswerable a face, a name, a narrative, not to pretend the answer has been found, but to make the question bearable enough to live inside. Chaos was not a problem the Greeks solved. It was a truth they learned to carry, and they carried it in the most human way possible, by telling stories. By saying, "Here is the gaping void. Here is the earth that groaned. Here is the sky that feared its own children. Here is the youngest son who grew in secret and returned to release what had been swallowed." These are not explanations. They are orientations, ways of standing in relation to the mystery rather than pretending to stand above it. What Gaia endured, the weight of the sky pressing down, the children sealed inside her, the long patience of the suffering that devises rather than collapses. This is not merely the Earth story. It is the story of every human being who has carried something too heavy for too long, and found within that carrying not defeat, but the slow, determined formation of a plan. What Rhea did, the quiet act of substitution, the stone wrapped in cloth, the truth hidden in a cave, this is not deception in the moral sense. It is preservation, the instinct of life to protect itself from the forces that would consume it before it has had a chance to become what it is meant to be, and Zeus standing at last in the open sky, thunder in his hands, the freed gods beside him, the Titans sealed below. Zeus is not a conclusion. He is a beginning. The Greeks knew this because they told 10,000 more stories after the Titanomachy. The cosmos settled into its new order, but the order was never static, never final, never truly secure, because that is what order is, in a universe born from chaos. Not a destination, a practice, something maintained through attention, through struggle, through the willingness to return again and again to the work of holding things together. The creation myth does not end, it transforms. It continues in every story the Greeks ever told afterward, in the wanderings of Odysseus, in the labors of Heracles, in the descent of Orpheus into the very Tartarus that holds the defeated Titans. Every subsequent myth is, in some sense, a return to the original questions. Who are we? What holds us together? What do we do with the darkness we carry? What do we do with the children we have swallowed out of fear? These are not ancient questions. They are the questions of this morning, of this moment. The Greeks looked at the night sky and saw Uranus still circling, wounded, diminished, but still there, still present in every act of rain and every flash of lightning that connects the height to the depth. They looked at the earth beneath their feet and knew that Gaia still carried Tartarus within her, that the deep places had not disappeared but only been sealed, and that what is sealed is not the same as what is gone. Perhaps that is the truest thing the Greek creation myth offers us across 3,000 years of distance, not an answer to where everything came from, but a way of understanding where we are. In the middle, always in the middle. Between the chaos that preceded us and the order we are still, imperfectly, courageously, necessarily, trying to build. And so the question that remains, the one only you can answer: what is the chaos you are still learning to carry, and what might emerge from it if you give it time enough to breathe? If this story moved something in you, consider subscribing so the next myth finds you when you're ready for it. Leave a comment with what you felt or with a myth you'd like us to explore next. This channel grows with your curiosity,